I could still hear the beeping of the machines when my son-in-law, Ethan, leaned close, his voice cold as steel. "Give her your kidney, Richard," he said, looking me dead in the eyes. "You owe us that much." His words hit harder than any punch I'd ever taken. My daughter, Lily, lay pale and fragile on the hospital bed, her breath shallow beneath the hum of the ventilator. My heart twisted with fear and guilt. I'd spent my life trying to protect her, and now I was being told I hadn't done enough. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting a harsh white glare on everything. I nodded without thinking, desperate to save her. "If it'll keep her alive, I'll do it," I whispered. But as they wheeled me toward surgery, something inside me felt wrong. Like I was walking into a trap I didn't understand. As they prepped me for surgery, a nurse asked me to count backward from 10. I tried to steady my breathing, but my mind wouldn't quiet down. Images of Lily as a little girl flashed before me, the way she used to run into my arms when I came home from the plant, her laughter echoing through our small Indiana house. That little girl couldn't hurt me. But the woman she'd become, I wasn't so sure. I felt the sting of the 4 as the anesthetic began to creep into my veins. My body felt heavy, my eyes fluttering. The last thing I saw before darkness closed in was Ethan's face, emotionless, calculating, as if this wasn't about saving anyone at all. "You're doing the right thing," he murmured. Finally, just before I drifted out completely, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't Ethan's. The doctor, a tall man with tired eyes, leaned down and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "Sir, you need to wake up. This isn't what you think." My eyelids fluttered open. The room blurred, the voices turned to echoes. "What do you mean?" I tried to say, but my tongue felt heavy, useless. He whispered again, lower this time. "It's not your daughter who needs the kidney." My heart slammed in my chest. I fought to stay awake, but the darkness swallowed me before I could ask another question. When I woke up, my throat was dry and sore, my arms strapped lightly to the hospital bed. The room was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I blinked hard, the fluorescent light cutting through the haze. My first thought was Lily. Was she okay? I turned my head and saw her room through the small window in the door. She was sitting up, awake, laughing. Ethan stood beside her, holding her hand. Relief washed over me, until I noticed the color in her cheeks, the strength in her posture. She didn't look like someone who'd just survived kidney failure. She looked fine. Too fine. Then I saw it, another bed, beside hers, covered by a curtain. A nurse's voice drifted through the air. "The transplant went well. She's stable now." My stomach turned. She. Not Lily. Someone else. The next few hours blurred together. Doctors came and went, checking my vitals, avoiding my eyes. I asked for answers, but all they gave me were polite smiles and vague reassurances. Finally, I caught sight of Ethan in the hallway. "Ethan," I croaked. He froze, then walked in, his usual smug calmness plastered across his face. "Hey, Dad," he said, as if nothing was wrong. "You did great." I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck. What did I do?" I asked. He smirked, glancing toward the room next door. "You saved someone's life." "Whose life?" I demanded. His smile widened, and I'll never forget what he said next. "My sister's." I felt my world tilt sideways. "Your sister?" I whispered. "What about Lily?" "You said." Ethan shrugged. "Lily's fine. She just had some minor kidney issues, but she's stable. My sister, though, she's been on the transplant list for years. You were a perfect match." I couldn't breathe. "You tricked me," I rasped. He didn't flinch. "Tricked? No. We just didn't tell you the full story. You wouldn't have agreed otherwise." His words dripped with arrogance, like he'd just pulled off something clever. "You owe our family, Richard," he said quietly. "You've had your time. Now it's about us." I stared at him, my hands trembling. "You used me," I said. "You stole from me." He smiled again. "Oh, come on. You've got one kidney left. You'll live." When I finally saw Lily, she couldn't look me in the eye. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, her eyes red from crying, or maybe from guilt. "Dad," she started, but I cut her off. "You knew." My voice cracked. She looked down. "Ethan said it was the only way. His sister, she's like family to me now." I stared at her, not recognizing the woman in front of me. "I gave you everything," I said softly. "Every dollar, every moment, every piece of me, and you gave me this?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't reach for me. Ethan stood behind her, his arm around her shoulder, his eyes daring me to say more. "It's done," he said flatly. "No point crying about it." I felt something inside me snap. Not anger, but something colder. Something older. The nurses said I needed rest, but there was no rest to be found. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smirk, that look of entitlement. I remembered every time I'd paid their bills, fixed their car, covered their rent. Every time Ethan had called me old man, and laughed about how out of touch I was. And now, he'd taken something from me I could never get back. Not money, not time, but my own flesh. My own blood. I stared out the hospital window that night, the city lights flickering in the distance, and I made myself a quiet promise. They may have taken my kidney, but they hadn't taken everything. The next morning, a young nurse came in to check my vitals. She smiled softly, avoiding the tension in the room. But when she leaned closer, she whispered, "You didn't hear this from me, but that surgery, it wasn't authorized. There's an investigation starting." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" I asked. She looked toward the door. "Your consent forms, they were altered. Someone forged your signature for the recipient switch." She glanced nervously at the door again and lowered her voice. "The doctor who operated, he's in trouble. He told the board something didn't feel right." My hands clenched around the bed sheets. Suddenly, the whisper before surgery made sense. "This isn't what you think." When Ethan came to visit again, I pretended to be weak, tired, and confused. I let him talk about Lily's recovery, about how we should all move on, about how family means sacrifice. He had no idea I already knew what he'd done. I smiled faintly, nodding, hiding the storm brewing inside me. "You're right, Ethan," I said softly. "Family does mean sacrifice." He smirked, thinking he'd won. But as he turned to leave, I said, "You've got no idea what you've started." He laughed without looking back. "Relax, old man. You'll forget all about this soon." What he didn't know was that the man he thought he'd outsmarted wasn't the fool he imagined. He'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because I wasn't just a tired old man with a pension and a heart full of regret. I was Richard Hale, a man who'd built a business from nothing, survived 2 recessions, and raised a family with his bare hands. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to forgive or forget. Ethan thought I was finished. But he had no idea who he was really dealing with. I wasn't always this broken, lying in a hospital bed with tubes running through me. There was a time when my hands were strong and steady, when my back didn't ache from age but from hard work. I spent 42 years in the same steel factory in Hammond, Indiana, Hale Manufacturing. My father started it after the war, and I took it over when he died. We weren't rich, but we were proud. We built bridges, water towers, and the kind of machinery that lasts a lifetime. I used to come home with grease under my nails and the smell of iron on my clothes, and Lily would run to the door shouting, "Daddy's home!" Those were the best years of my life. Back then, I thought love was unbreakable. I thought family meant forever. Lily's mother, Janet, was the kind of woman who could make a house feel alive. She had a laugh that could warm up a room, and a temper that could stop it cold. We were married 40 years before cancer took her from me. I still remember holding her hand that last night in hospice, the way she squeezed my fingers and whispered, "Promise me you'll take care of Lily." I nodded, choking back tears. Always. That promise became the compass for the rest of my life. Every decision, every sacrifice, every dollar I ever spent after that moment, it was all for Lily. I didn't date again. Didn't travel. Didn't retire. My world shrank down to one purpose: keeping my daughter safe. Lily wasn't always easy to protect. She was bright, ambitious, and too trusting for her own good. When she met Ethan, I saw the warning signs right away. He was charming, smooth, the kind of man who knew how to make people like him, especially people with money. He came from nothing, or so he said, and he wore that story like armor. "I just want to build something real," he told me the night we met. But when I asked him what he did for work, he smiled and said, "A bit of everything." That should have been my first clue. Lily was smitten, though, and after losing her mother, I didn't have the heart to stand in her way. I told myself he'd grow up. I was wrong. When they married, I gave them everything: the down payment on their house, the new car, even a stake in the business. I told Ethan it was a chance to prove himself. Instead, he proved something else entirely. Within a year, he'd convinced Lily to sell her shares for convenience, telling her he'd reinvest it for their future. The money vanished within months. I later found out he'd used it to pay off gambling debts. When I confronted him, he just smirked. "You said it was a gift, right? Gifts don't come with strings." Lily defended him, of course. "He's just had bad luck, Dad. You've always told me everyone deserves a second chance. I did say that. I just never thought it would come back to haunt me. I spent the next decade cleaning up after them, paying their bills, fixing their cars, covering their mortgage when Ethan lost his job for the 5th time. Every time I told myself it was the last, and every time Lily would show up crying, saying, "Please, Dad, just one more time," I could never say no. Not to her. Not after that promise to Janet. I started selling off parts of the company to stay afloat. My retirement fund disappeared. My savings evaporated. But whenever I looked at Lily, I saw her mother's eyes, the same soft blue that had once looked at me with pride. I told myself it was worth it. That's what fathers do. They give until there's nothing left. When I finally did retire at 70, the company was gone. Ethan had convinced Lily that selling it to a tech partnership would make us millionaires. It didn't. He took the payout and spent it faster than I could blink. By the time I realized what happened, I was left with nothing but the house Janet and I built together and a pension check that barely covered groceries. But even then, I didn't blame Lily. I blamed myself. I'd made her soft. I'd made her dependent. Every time she stumbled, I was there to catch her. And in doing so, I never let her learn how to stand on her own. That's a father's curse. We love too hard, too blindly. 2 years later, when Lily called crying and said she was sick, I didn't hesitate. "I'll do whatever it takes," I told her. The doctors said she had kidney failure. Ethan did most of the talking that day, explaining the options, the costs, the waiting list. "There's one hope," he said. "A direct transplant. You're a match, Richard." He didn't call me Dad anymore, just Richard. It was subtle, but it told me everything I needed to know. Still, I agreed. I told myself I could live with one kidney, but I couldn't live without my daughter. The next week, they scheduled the surgery. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my pastor, not even my old foreman, Carl, who'd always told me to watch my back. "People take advantage of good men," Carl used to say. "Don't let kindness make you a fool." But I guess I already was one. Looking back, there were signs that something wasn't right. The hospital paperwork seemed rushed, Ethan handled most of it, and Lily barely spoke during the meetings. She just stared out the window, lost in her own thoughts. The night before the surgery, I sat at my kitchen table staring at a photograph of Janet holding baby Lily in her arms. I whispered to that photo, "I'm keeping my promise, January. I'm saving our girl." I wish I'd known then what was really happening, that my promise was about to be twisted into something cruel and selfish, that the people I loved most were using that promise against me. After the surgery, when I found out the truth, something inside me cracked wide open. But as the nurse's words echoed in my head, the surgery wasn't authorized, another part of me started to wake up. The part I'd buried under years of guilt and sacrifice. Because the truth is, I wasn't some helpless old man. Before I sold the company, I'd made one smart move. I'd quietly transferred a portion of our assets into a trust, one only I controlled. The documents were buried deep, under a false business name, tied to holdings Ethan would never know existed. I'd built that fund for Lily's future. But now it might serve a very different purpose. I looked at my reflection in the hospital window that night, pale, bruised, but alive. I thought about everything I'd given up, every kindness I'd offered that had been thrown back in my face. I realized something I should have understood long ago. Love without respect isn't love. It's servitude. And I'd been a servant for too long. Ethan thought he'd taken everything from me, but he didn't know about the trust, the contacts I still had in the business world, or the lawyer who still owed me a favor. He thought I was old, broken, finished. But he was wrong. Dead wrong. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I made myself another promise, not to Janet this time, but to myself. I wasn't going to beg for their love anymore. I wasn't going to explain, justify, or plead. The next time I saw Ethan, I'd be standing. The next time he looked me in the eyes, he'd see the man he underestimated. Because I may have given away my kidney, but I still had my spine. And soon, he'd learn that the cost of betrayal is far greater than he could ever imagine. He had no idea that my years of sacrifice were about to be tested in ways he never imagined. The weeks after the surgery crawled by in a fog of pain and disbelief. My body healed slower than I expected, but the real wounds weren't the stitches across my abdomen, they were the ones nobody could see. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Ethan's voice in my head, "You owe us that much." I replayed it again and again, trying to understand how someone could say that to me, to the man who had given them everything. When I finally got discharged, Lily didn't even come to pick me up. She texted instead, "Ethan's car broke down. Can you Uber home, Dad? I'll call later." I sat there in the hospital lobby, a plastic bag with my discharge papers in one hand and a cane in the other, realizing that somewhere along the way, I had stopped being family. I had become an obligation. When I got home, the house felt different. Smaller somehow, emptier. Dust coated the shelves where Janet's photos once stood, and the air smelled stale. I used to keep the place spotless, but the recovery had drained the strength out of me. I sat in Janet's old recliner, staring at the wedding photo on the mantel, the one where Lily stood beside Ethan, her eyes bright, her smile wide. I'd paid for everything that day, the dress, the venue, the honeymoon, and I'd told myself it was worth it. But now, looking at that photo, all I saw was the beginning of my own undoing. I picked it up, my hand trembling, and whispered, "I hope you're proud of yourself, Richard. You raised a princess and handed her to a con man." A few days later, Ethan showed up at my door unannounced, as if nothing had happened. He didn't even knock, just walked in, a six-pack in his hand, wearing that same smug grin that made my blood boil. "You should keep the door locked, old man," he said casually. "Neighborhood's getting rough." He tossed a beer onto the table, cracking one open for himself. I didn't move. "What do you want, Ethan?" He shrugged. "Just checking in. Making sure you're not doing anything stupid. You know, like talking to the hospital or the cops." My jaw tightened. "What makes you think I'd do that?" He smiled, sipping his beer. "Because you're sentimental. You care too much about family. And if you talk, Lily's the one who gets dragged into it. You don't want that, do you?" The threat was clear, wrapped in charm, hidden behind a smirk. That was Ethan's specialty. That night, I couldn't sleep. The doctor's whisper kept replaying in my mind. "This isn't what you think." I started to wonder how deep the deception went. Did Lily really know the truth about the transplant? Or had Ethan forged her into his accomplice without her even realizing it? I wanted to believe she was innocent. But every time I called, she let it ring to voicemail. I left messages, kind ones at first, then desperate ones, then angry ones. Weeks passed, and not a single call came back. One evening, when I finally reached her, her tone was cold. "Dad, please don't make things harder than they already are. Ethan's under a lot of stress. He didn't mean to hurt you." I laughed bitterly. "Didn't mean to? He stole a part of my body, Lily." There was silence on the other end, then a soft, tired sigh. "Maybe it's time you let the past go." The line went dead. I sat there staring at the phone, realizing I'd lost her, not to death, but to something worse. To him. The months that followed were a parade of small humiliations. Ethan borrowed my truck, for a few days, and kept it for 3 weeks. When I finally got it back, it reeked of cigarettes and cheap perfume. Lily came by once, bringing leftovers and an awkward smile, like a stranger visiting out of guilt. I tried to talk to her, to reach her, but every conversation ended the same way, with her defending Ethan. "He's trying, Dad," she'd say, her voice trembling between love and denial. I wanted to shake her and say, "Can't you see what he's doing to us?" But I didn't. I just nodded, too tired to fight anymore. That's how it works, you know. Abuse doesn't always come with bruises or yelling. Sometimes it's quiet, a slow erosion of dignity that makes you doubt your own worth. There were days when I thought about ending it all, about letting the pills on my nightstand take me to where Janet waited. But then I'd remember her voice, the promise I made, and something inside me would refuse to die. I started taking walks around the neighborhood, slow and shaky at first, then longer each day. The air felt different outside, real. People waved, asked how I was doing. I even reconnected with Carl, my old foreman. He'd retired years before, but he still had that sharp look in his eyes. "You look like hell, Rich," he said when we met at the diner. "What happened to you?" I told him everything, the surgery, the lies, the forged papers. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he leaned back and whistled low. "That boy's playing you for a fool. And your daughter, she's in deep. But if you've still got that fire in you, I know a way to fight back." Carl introduced me to Maggie, a paralegal who'd worked for a firm that handled medical fraud cases. She was in her 40s, sharp as a tack, and not easily intimidated. When I told her my story, she took notes without saying a word. Then she looked me dead in the eye. "You said your consent form was forged?" I nodded. "I want copies of everything. The hospital has to keep them on file. We'll start there." For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was small, fragile, but it was enough to keep me going. I didn't tell Lily or Ethan about Maggie or Carl. I smiled when they visited, nodded when they lied, and played the part of the frail old man. But inside, the old Richard, the man who built a company from the ground up, was coming back to life. Ethan's manipulation didn't stop. He started dropping hints about inheritance, asking casual questions about my house, my will, my savings. "You don't want the state to take it all when you go," he'd say, pretending to be helpful. "You should really put things in writing." I played dumb, pretending not to notice the greed behind his concern. "You're probably right," I said one afternoon, sipping my coffee. "I'll make sure everything goes to family." He grinned, thinking he'd just secured his future. But I already had other plans. I'd met with my lawyer 2 weeks earlier and rewritten everything, every cent, every asset, locked away until certain conditions were met. Ethan's name wasn't on a single page. But Lily's was, if she ever chose to break free from him. As winter set in, I noticed something shifting in me. The anger that once burned hot started to cool into something sharper: purpose. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a man collecting evidence. Maggie got the hospital files. She was right. My signature had been altered. The original consent form named Lily as the recipient. But a second version, filed 2 days later, listed Jennifer Moore, Ethan's sister. The handwriting was a perfect imitation. Almost perfect. Almost. There were subtle differences, the slant of the R, the loop in the H. A forensic analyst would spot it immediately. And when he did, the truth would come out. Ethan's web of lies was unraveling, and he didn't even know it. The last time Ethan came over, he looked different, thinner, jumpier. "You've been quiet lately," he said, pacing the living room. "That's not like you." I smiled faintly. "Maybe I've learned to pick my battles." He chuckled nervously. "Good. Because you don't want trouble, old man. You really don't." He leaned closer. "You stay quiet, and maybe I'll make sure you're taken care of when the time comes." I stared into his eyes, seeing the coward beneath the confidence. "You're right, Ethan," I said slowly. "I don't want trouble. But sometimes trouble has a way of finding people who deserve it." He didn't understand what I meant. Not yet. But he would. As he walked out that night, his laughter echoing down the hallway, I felt something inside me settle. Not peace, but resolve. The years of silence, the endless giving, the constant humiliation, they were over. I had spent a lifetime being everyone's savior, everyone's safety net. But I was done. Ethan thought I was still the man who'd signed away his kidney without a question. He had no idea that man was gone. The one standing in his place was someone new, someone dangerous. Because I was done being everyone's doormat. It was time to remind them who they were dealing with. Maggie wasn't the kind of woman who liked small talk. "If we're going to do this, Mr. Hale," she said, spreading the documents across my kitchen table, "you need to be ready for what we might find." I nodded, adjusting my glasses as she slid a thick file toward me. Hospital records, bank transactions, signatures, even text logs. I pulled every string I could. Her tone was calm, but I could tell she was angry, not for herself, but for me. "What they did to you isn't just unethical," she said. "It's criminal." I stared at the papers, my stomach twisting. My name appeared again and again. Forged, altered, manipulated. The worst part was seeing Lily's initials on one of the forms. I didn't know if she'd signed it willingly or if Ethan had pushed her. Either way, the betrayal cut deep. Carl came over later that evening, carrying 2 coffees and a bag of donuts. He was retired, but he still moved like a man who'd spent a lifetime running things. "You always said you'd die working," he grumbled, sitting across from me. "Guess you weren't kidding." He studied the documents for a long moment, then whistled low. "These boys don't know who they're messing with, Rich." I chuckled softly. "I think they do. They just think I'm too old to fight back." Carl smirked. "Then let's show them what old looks like when it's angry." For the first time in years, I laughed. It felt strange, but good. The kind of laugh that comes when you remember what it means to stand up straight again. Over the next few weeks, Maggie started digging deeper. She found that Ethan had been moving money through multiple accounts under false names. One of them, RE Holdings LLC, made me pause. Those were my initials. He'd used my identity to secure loans, mortgages, even credit lines. The man wasn't just greedy, he was reckless. "He's drowning in debt," Maggie said, flipping through her notes. "He's borrowed against your house, your name, even your legacy. The banks think you're partners." My fists clenched so hard my nails dug into my palms. "Can we prove it?" Maggie smiled, the kind of smile that meant trouble for someone else. "Already working on it. You just need to stay quiet and let me build the case." While she handled the legal side, I started doing what I did best, gathering intelligence. I might have been old, but I hadn't lost my instincts. In the business world, people talk. and they remember who treated them right. I called a few old contacts, men who still owed me favors from the factory days. One of them, a guy named Travis Yates, ran a private security firm in Chicago. Rich Hale. Man, I thought you were dead, he laughed when he answered. Not yet, I said. But I might be if I don't figure out what's going on with my family. Within days, Travis had someone shadowing Ethan. What they found made my blood run cold. He wasn't just lying about money, he was lying about everything. The photos came first, Ethan meeting a woman outside a fancy restaurant in downtown Chicago. She wasn't Lily. She was younger, maybe late 20s, with long red hair and a diamond bracelet that could have paid my mortgage twice over. The reports said her name was Dana. She was on his payroll, officially as an investment partner. Unofficially, she was his mistress. He'd been funneling money to her for months. When I saw the photos, my first instinct was anger. But what came after that was sadness. Not just for me, but for Lily. My daughter had sacrificed everything for that man, and he traded her love for greed. Get me everything, I told Travis. Every account, every alias, every lie. He didn't ask why. He just nodded. You got it, boss. By the time spring came, I had a binder full of evidence. Forged signatures, hidden accounts, recorded calls, photographs, even voicemails where Ethan bragged about finally putting the old man in his place. Each page felt like a blade cutting deeper, but I didn't flinch. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. One night, I sat at the kitchen table flipping through the binder, when Maggie called. You sitting down? She asked. Always. She took a breath. That kidney recipient, Jennifer Moore, she's not Ethan's sister. She's his ex-girlfriend. They were engaged 5 years ago. I froze. What? They broke up when she got sick, Maggie continued. She was on the transplant list for years. Ethan used you to save her. My hand tightened around the phone. He stole my body to save his ex. My voice cracked. That's not just betrayal. That's evil. Maggie's voice softened. It's worse than that, Richard. She's been making payments to him ever since. The next day, I went to visit Lily. It had been months since we'd spoken in person. She opened the door slowly, her face pale and tired. Dad, she whispered, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to say it. I smiled gently. Can I come in? Ethan wasn't home. The house smelled like lavender and dust. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place she'd once done her homework as a kid. Lily, I said quietly, do you know who Jennifer Moore is? Her eyes darted away. Ethan told me she's his sister. She's not. I slid a photo across the table, Ethan and Jennifer, holding hands outside a restaurant. Lily's lip trembled. Where did you get this? She whispered. It doesn't matter. What matters is that he's been lying to you, about everything. Tears welled in her eyes. No, she said, shaking her head. He loves me. I wanted to believe that too once. He loves himself, I said softly. You're just his safety net. Lily broke down that night. She told me everything, the debts, the fights, the manipulation. He says he'll change, she cried. Every time he says it. I reached across the table and took her hand. I used to believe in second chances too, sweetheart. Until I realized some people just see kindness as weakness. She looked at me, eyes red and swollen. What are you going to do? I hesitated, then said the truth. Whatever it takes. For the first time in years, she didn't argue. She just nodded. I'm scared, she whispered. So is he, I said. He just doesn't know it yet. The next week, Maggie called again. We've got enough to bring him down legally, she said. Fraud, identity theft, forgery, the list goes on. But if you want this done right, we need to be smart. No confrontation until we're ready. I agreed. But deep down, I knew something Maggie didn't. I wasn't just after justice. I was after understanding. I needed Ethan to know what he'd taken from me, and what it was going to cost him. I wasn't the kind of man who believed in revenge, but this wasn't revenge. This was balance. As I stood by the window that night, watching the streetlights flicker, I thought about Janet again. Her laughter, her faith in me, her belief that goodness always wins. I still wanted to believe that. But sometimes goodness needs a push. Sometimes justice wears a meaner face. I wasn't proud of what I was planning, but it had to be done. Ethan had built his life on lies. I was going to use those lies to bury him. Armed with this information, I was ready to teach everyone a lesson they'd never forget. I learned long ago that patience was a weapon. In business, You wait for the other man to blink, and he always does. I'd spent weeks watching Ethan, letting Maggie build the legal backbone and Travis stitch together the dirty threads of his life. Now it was time to arrange the pieces so the dominoes would fall exactly where I wanted them to. I wasn't interested in spectacle for spectacle's sake. I wanted precise consequences. I wanted the truth to land on him in a way that hurt where most liars are softest: his pride, his money, and the face he showed to the world. I folded my hospital blanket tight around my knees, feeling the familiar hum of resolve. This was not cruelty. It was accounting. First, I tightened the lock on the little trust account I'd set up years ago, the one Ethan never knew existed. It looked like a modest retirement fund on paper, something to make anyone comfortable, but under the surface it was a legal mechanism. With Maggie's help I renounced any verbal promises I'd ever made, activated stipulations that required proof of responsible conduct for distributions, and set the conditions so tightly that Ethan's habits would disqualify him instantly. I rewrote wills, signed new deeds that favored Lily only if she separated herself legally from Ethan, and created a clause that would trigger a forensic audit of any accounts bearing his name or alias. The trust was a mousetrap. He'd been nibbling at the edges for years. Now he would step in. While the lawyers did their careful work, I set the softer snares. I reached out to people Ethan had wronged years ago, men whose mortgages he'd promised to refinance and never did, suppliers he'd stiffed, even a landlord in a Cleveland apartment building he'd skipped on rent. I asked them one simple thing: tell the truth if you're ever asked. I told them I wasn't looking for revenge. I wanted the record straight. Pride and bitterness can be powerful allies when you know how to stir them. When the time came, their testimony would show a pattern, and the pattern would make a jury see him not as a one-off hustler but as a career fraud. Next, I seeded doubt in the places he cared about most. I called a reporter I once helped when he'd broken a story about corporate waste and asked him to look into a quiet string of medical irregularities at the hospital. Nothing that would implicate the institution without proof, but enough to make the hospital administration nervous. The hospital feared scandal more than it feared lawsuits. That fear would make people docile and honest in ways threats never could. Meanwhile, Travis quietly arranged for Ethan's phone and emails to be monitored by a private investigator. Legally, through the thin ribbon of consent he'd left behind while boasting to friends, so we could build a timeline of lies that matched the forged signatures Maggie had already found. I also had to pull Lily closer without pushing. She needed to believe she had something to gain by stepping away, not just a reason to feel ashamed. One afternoon, I invited her to lunch at the diner where Carl and I always met. I didn't accuse, I simply showed her things: bank statements, photographs, text messages that proved what Ethan had whispered in private. She read, lips pressed thin, her face an open wound of shock and sorrow. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. I said what I always said when truth and love collide: because I wanted you to have your life. Then I added quietly, now I want you to have your dignity back. She looked at me, the old light flickering in her eyes for the first time in months. She didn't forgive him in a moment, but she began to see him with new eyes. The plan hinged on timing. I scheduled meetings, staggered announcements, and arranged for various parties to converge at a town hall-style hearing I'd quietly asked the local council to hold about predatory lending in small businesses. It was the kind of civic forum that draws good people and nosy neighbors, people who either remember your name or want to see justice done. On that same day, Maggie planned to file the formal complaint about the forged consent forms, and Travis scheduled a discreet transfer block with the bank on the accounts showing Ethan's fraudulent loans. I wanted the world to watch a respectable man unravel while the community listened and the paper recorded every moment. I'll admit, a part of me felt like a thief. I was taking what had once been simple and turning it into a hunt. But then I thought about the nights Lily cried on our porch, about Janet's gentle demand that I protect our child, and the shape of that promise hardened into purpose. There was a strategic mercy in my methods. I made sure Jennifer Moore, the woman who'd received my kidney, was treated fairly in the filings. She was sick and scared and needed compassion. Exposing Ethan didn't require me to strip another human being to the bone. That was important to me. Justice with cruelty is still cruelty. Justice with care is what changes people. On the morning I'd chosen, I woke before sunrise. The hospital lights still lingered like a dull star in the distance as I took a slow walk to clear the fog of sleep and pain. Carl met me at the corner, and he had that glint in his eye, the one he got before a good fight. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked. I nodded. "It's not about spite," I said. "It's about meaning." We went over the sequence again: the forum, the bank freeze, Maggie's filing, the pressman's inquiry, followed by a quiet demand for restitution to Lily and the trust triggering its audit clause. Everything depended on one falsehood being revealed in front of many witnesses. Ethan, of course, had no idea. He continued his usual acts of boldness that morning: a social media post about a family brunch at his house, a showy new watch in the photos, Dana's hand casually draped over his shoulder in one picture like a trophy. He liked to perform how successful he was. Arrogance is a billboard for the insecure. He sent me a text that afternoon, a short one, smug as a cat. Hope you're resting, old man. We'll take care of the funeral arrangements when the time comes. I read it twice, then smiled and saved it. Proof is a patient thing. It waits for you to collect it. When the forum began that evening, the room was packed. Neighbors, local business owners, a handful of reporters, and more than one person who already suspected something. I sat with Lily in the third row, watching Ethan swagger in, looking for an audience. He took the stage with confidence, smiling like he'd rehearsed sincerity. The first speaker told a story about a small contractor who'd been taken by a clever man with a handshake and a promise. The second spoke of a woman whose signatures had been manipulated. By the time Maggie stood to speak, my binder was heavy in my lap. She calmly presented the facts, the altered forms, the shell companies, the shadow accounts, and then she dropped the hard detail that would make men shift in their seats. The name on the recipient form had been changed after the surgery. The room hummed. People leaned in. Ethan tried to laugh it off. He stood, voice smooth and practiced, and told a story of sacrifice and family, of how he'd been trying to hold things together. He looked at me then, eyes searching for the easy victory, the pity that had sustained him for years. Instead, he found silence. Then, from the back of the room, a man stood and said, "You took advantage of a man who loved too much." Others followed. Testimonies matched our evidence. The bank called in the middle of the forum to confirm a freeze on accounts linked to RE Holdings LLC. The hospital administrator, uncomfortable and pale, said they had opened an internal review. The whispers swelled into a roar. And through it all, Ethan's face changed, curiosity curdling into fear. The next day would change everything. Ethan was about to learn the most expensive lesson of their life. The next morning, sunlight hit my kitchen table like a spotlight. The binder of evidence lay open, pages fluttering slightly in the draft from the window. The town was already buzzing. I could feel it. What had happened at the forum last night spread faster than gossip at a church picnic. My phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Reporters, lawyers, even old factory hands who wanted to make sure I'd finally gotten him. I ignored most of it. Today wasn't about applause. Today was about truth landing exactly where it needed to, right in front of Ethan. By 10 o'clock, Maggie called. "He's on his way to your house," she said. "He's angry, but he's scared too." I took a slow sip of my coffee and smiled faintly. "Good," I said. "Fear makes men honest." Carl was already sitting on the porch, a mug of black coffee in his hand, watching the road like a sentry. "You sure you want to be alone with him?" he asked. "Yeah," I said quietly. "He needs to see me as I am, not as he remembers." The hum of tires on gravel grew louder. A black SUV pulled into the driveway. Ethan stepped out, his eyes wild, his jaw tight. He was still wearing the same expensive jacket from last night, but the confidence was gone. He slammed the door and marched toward me. "You ruined my life," he shouted. "You think this makes you a hero? You made me look like a criminal in front of everyone." I stood slowly, steady on my feet. "I didn't make you a criminal, Ethan," I said. "You did that all by yourself." He froze at the edge of the porch steps, breathing hard. "You don't know what you've done," he hissed. "You've embarrassed Lily, you've—" "No," I interrupted. "I freed her." His mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time since I'd known him, Ethan Hale didn't have a script. I motioned toward the porch chair. "Sit down," I said. He hesitated, then dropped into it, shoulders rigid. I slid the binder across the table between us. "Every page in here," I said, "is a lie you told. A document you forged. A person you used." He looked down, refusing to touch it. "You think this makes you powerful," he muttered. "You're still just an old man trying to control everyone." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "No, son. I'm an old man reminding you that control without conscience is just chaos. And you've lived in chaos for too long." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Birds chirped in the distance. The air felt heavy, like the world itself was listening. Finally, Ethan whispered, "You don't understand what it's like to fail." I stared at him. I spent 30 years running a company through 3 recessions. I buried my wife. I watched my daughter nearly die. Don't talk to me about failure. You've never failed because you've never taken responsibility for anything in your life. His eyes flickered, the mask cracking just enough to show the fear beneath. "I just wanted to build something," he said weakly. "Something of my own." "You could have built it with honesty," I said softly. "Instead, you built it on my back." I opened the binder and flipped to a photo, Him and Jennifer outside the hospital. Was this part of your empire too? His face drained of color. She was dying, he said quietly. I thought if I saved her, maybe, he trailed off. Maybe you'd finally be worth something? I asked. He looked away. For the first time, he didn't answer. That silence was all the confession I needed. I stood up slowly and handed him an envelope. Inside is a copy of the transfer documents and the signed legal notice Maggie filed this morning, I said. The banks will be reclaiming every cent tied to the fraudulent accounts. The trust has been locked. You have no access to my estate, to Lily's inheritance, or to anything under my name. He tore open the envelope, scanning the papers, his breathing quickening. You can't do this, he said. You'll destroy your own family's reputation. I smiled sadly. No, Ethan. You already did that. I'm just cleaning up the mess. Just then, another car pulled up. Lily stepped out, her face pale but calm. She walked slowly toward the porch, eyes fixed on Ethan. Dad told me everything, she said. Her voice trembled, but she didn't falter. Is it true? About Jennifer? About the money? Ethan stood, desperate. Lily, please, I did it for us. For our future. She shook her head. Our future, she whispered. You sold my father's name. You used his body. Her voice cracked, but she kept her chin high. I can't do this anymore. Ethan reached for her hand, but she stepped back. Lily, don't, I warned. Let him stand on his own. She turned to me, tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, Dad, she whispered. For believing him. For not seeing what you saw. I shook my head. You have nothing to be sorry for, I said softly. Love makes fools of the best of us. Ethan's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. So what now? He muttered. You gonna have me arrested? I looked at him for a long time before answering. Not today, I said. I want you to live long enough to see what honesty looks like. You'll find out it's heavier than money, but it's worth more. He laughed bitterly. You think this makes you better than me? I sighed. No, I said quietly. It just makes me free. He stared at me, eyes hollow. Then he turned and walked down the steps, his boots crunching against the gravel. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, the kind a father feels when he realizes the boy he tried to save has chosen his own destruction. But pity was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Some lessons only sink in when everything else is stripped away. Carl came out as the SUV disappeared down the road. Well, he said, that's that. I watched the dust settle behind Ethan's car. No, I said. That's just the beginning. I could feel it, the weight lifting, the quiet space inside me where rage used to live. I wasn't sure what would come next. Forgiveness, maybe, or something close to it. But I knew one thing for certain. I had taken my name back. I had taken my life back. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. But this was only the beginning. I had years of disrespect to address. The world has a strange way of correcting itself when truth finally surfaces. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, the ripples of what happened spread further than I'd imagined. People I hadn't heard from in years reached out. Old co-workers, neighbors, even Janet's sister from Oregon, all saying the same thing. We always knew you were the good one, Richard. It was nice to hear, sure, but the praise didn't soothe me. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I was looking for balance. The truth hadn't finished its work yet, not until everyone who'd helped Ethan's schemes faced what they'd done. Maggie moved fast. She coordinated with the authorities to finish building the case. The district attorney's office picked it up almost immediately. Forgery, fraud, medical misrepresentation, the list was long, and the evidence airtight. Ethan was officially under investigation, but I asked Maggie to hold back on one thing, pressing criminal charges. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. You have him dead to rights, she said. He could serve 10 years easy. I leaned back in my chair and shook my head. Let him keep his freedom, I said. It'll torment him more when the world knows who he is, but he can't escape it. Maggie smiled faintly. You're colder than I thought. I sighed. No. Just tired of fire. Lily filed for divorce 2 days later. She called me after signing the papers, her voice small but steady. I thought it would break me, she said. But it didn't. I told her the truth. That's what survival feels like at first. It stings, then it steadies you. She cried softly, but there was strength in it this time. She'd found a part of herself Ethan had tried to bury, her self-respect. She moved into my house for a while, sleeping in her old room with its faded posters and wooden dresser. At night, I'd hear her crying sometimes, but by morning, she'd be making coffee and humming. Healing is noisy before it's peaceful. News of Ethan's downfall made the local papers. Businessman under investigation for medical fraud, the headline read. His face was there, right under the banner. When I saw it, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt done. The article mentioned me briefly, retired factory owner Richard Hale, and described how the victim's generosity had been exploited. Neighbors came by with pies, casseroles, and sympathy. It was a kind of small-town justice, not harsh, but firm. The community that once pitted me now respected me again. Respect feels different when you've had to fight to earn it back. Ethan's world collapsed quietly. His business partners cut ties. Dana disappeared. Rumor was she'd sold off what little was left and fled the state. The house went into foreclosure. He moved into a small rental apartment outside town, where people pretended not to recognize him. Carl drove by once, said Ethan looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. "You really broke him," he said. I shook my head. He broke himself. I just stopped cushioning the fall. It was strange. I'd spent months preparing for a fight, and now that it was over, there was no satisfaction, just silence. But not everyone had turned against me. Some of the people who'd believed Ethan's lies came forward to apologize. My nephew Danny, who'd once called me a stubborn old fool for not trusting Ethan, showed up one evening on my porch with a six-pack of root beer. "You were right," he said, eyes low. "We were wrong to doubt you." I nodded, clinking bottles with him. "We all get fooled sometimes," I said. "What matters is what you do when you wake up." He grinned. "Guess that's your way of forgiving me?" I smiled faintly. "Guess so. The truth is, forgiveness doesn't happen all at once. It's something you practice, like breathing again after being underwater." Meanwhile, the investigation turned up more victims, people Ethan had swindled years before. Some of them were angry, others just relieved someone had finally stopped him. One woman, a retired nurse named Paula, showed up at my door with a small box. Inside was an old letter Ethan had written her, full of lies about investments that never existed. "I've kept it for years," she said. "I wanted to burn it, but maybe you should have it." I took it carefully, realizing that even strangers had been carrying pieces of his deceit all this time. Sometimes the weight of one man's sin gets spread so thin that no one realizes they're all carrying a part of it. One afternoon, Maggie brought over the final documents from the trust reformation. Everything was legally sealed. Ethan couldn't touch a cent. I sat at the kitchen table signing the last paper, the same table where I'd almost lost my life for him. "You did good, Richard," she said. "You didn't just get justice. You got peace." I looked up and smiled faintly. "Peace is expensive," I said. "But it's worth the price." Maggie chuckled. "You ever think about writing a book?" "Nah," I said. "Who'd read about an old fool who finally grew a spine?" She looked at me for a long moment. "Plenty of people, I think." When the dust settled, people began to remember more than the scandal. They remembered how I'd helped build the town's factory, how I'd paid for the local park when the council ran out of funds, how I'd helped employees keep their homes during hard times. Ethan had taken my reputation, but time had given it back, polished and stronger. That was the real reckoning, not his downfall, but my restoration. Even Lily began to laugh again. She got a job at a community center helping families manage medical debt. She said it was her way of turning pain into purpose. I couldn't have been prouder. Then, one morning, a letter came, from Ethan. The handwriting was shaky. "I've lost everything," it read. "You were right. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway. I don't want to die like this." I read it 3 times, then set it down. 4 hours, I just stared out the window, listening to the clock tick. Forgiveness isn't about what they deserve. It's about what you need to let go of. So I wrote back, "You were a fool. But I was a fool too, for believing that love could change greed. I forgive you, not because you earned it, but because I don't want to carry your sin any longer." I mailed it without a return address. Some weights aren't meant to come back. When I went to bed that night, I thought of Janet. I imagined her smiling, the way she used to when something in her garden finally bloomed after a long winter. Maybe that's what forgiveness really is, something fragile that still grows in broken soil. As the moonlight spilled across my room, I realized that every storm I'd been through had led me here, to peace, to truth, and to the quiet dignity of a man who finally remembered his worth. As the dust settled, everyone realized that Richard Hale had taught them the most important lesson of their lives. Spring came early that year. The snow melted fast, leaving the grass damp and bright like new life was trying to break through the dirt. I stood on my porch that morning, coffee steaming in my hands, watching the light spill across the quiet street. It had been almost 6 months since the forum, since the truth came out, since Ethan's world, and mine, finally stopped spinning. The air smelled different now. Clean. Honest. Peaceful. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up thinking about what I'd lost. I woke up grateful for what was left. Lily had moved into a small house just a few blocks away. She came by every Sunday for breakfast, always bringing a pie or some flowers. I'd make coffee, she'd hum along to the radio, and the house that once felt haunted by betrayal now felt alive again. "You look good, Dad," she said one morning, flipping pancakes. "You finally put some weight back on." I laughed. Guess stress wasn't much of a diet plan. She smiled and reached over to squeeze my hand. "You saved me," she said softly. I looked at her, the woman she'd become, stronger, wiser, her eyes bright with her mother's same quiet fire. "No," I said. "You saved yourself. I just stood beside you long enough for you to remember who you were." Ethan never returned to town. Last I heard, he'd moved out west, doing odd jobs, trying to rebuild whatever life he could salvage. The DA had agreed not to press charges as long as he paid restitution to the victims and stayed out of trouble. Maggie said he was cooperating. I believed her. I wanted to. Some men only learn through loss. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate's a heavy coat. It keeps you warm for a while, but you can't move forward wearing it forever. When I thought of Ethan now, I felt something closer to pity. Maybe one day he'd find a piece of the truth we'd all bled for. Maybe not. Either way, that wasn't my burden anymore. Maggie stopped by often, still carrying too many files even when she promised to take a day off. She'd become something like family. "You know," she said one afternoon, leaning on the porch railing, "you could sue the hospital. Win big, too." I chuckled. "I don't need more money. I just need better mornings." She smiled. "You've got those now." I nodded, watching Lily play with her dog in the yard. "Yeah," I said softly. "I finally do." Maggie gave me a look, half respect, half curiosity. "What will you do next?" I shrugged. "Maybe fix up the old workshop. Maybe teach kids how to build something real again. Wood doesn't lie. People could use a reminder of that." She laughed. "You're something else, Richard Hale." I grinned. "So they tell me." Carl, bless him, never stopped checking in. Every Friday we'd sit at the diner, drinking bad coffee and pretending we still understood the world. "Can't believe you turned your life into a whole courtroom drama," he said one afternoon. "Should have sold the rights to Netflix." I laughed so hard the waitress turned around. "Nah," I said. "Nobody'd believe an old man could pull that off." Carl grinned. "Maybe that's the point. People need to be reminded that old doesn't mean finished." He was right. I'd spent so much of my life giving everything to everyone else that I'd forgotten what it felt like to live for myself. Now, every sunrise felt like borrowed grace. As summer came, the town began to rebuild its faith in me. The mayor asked if I'd speak at the local community center about integrity in business. The irony made me smile, but I agreed. When I stood before that crowd, I didn't talk about betrayal or revenge. I talked about kindness and accountability, how the two aren't opposites but partners. "Sometimes," I told them, "the strongest man in the room isn't the loudest one. He's the one who refuses to let anger decide who he is." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was real. That's all I'd ever wanted. Lily found her rhythm again, too. Her job at the community center turned into a full-time position helping families manage debt. She told me once, "I want to be the person I needed when I was scared." I couldn't think of a better purpose. On weekends, she'd bring her coworkers over for barbecues, and the backyard would fill with laughter. The sound of it felt like medicine. Every giggle, every spark of joy stitched something inside me that had been torn apart for too long. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit in Janet's old chair by the window. The stars would shimmer above the dark fields, and I'd talk to her like I used to when the world was too quiet. "You'd like how things turned out," I'd whisper. "Lily's happy. I'm finally learning to breathe again. You were right, you know. Kindness isn't weakness, it's just quieter than anger." The wind would move through the trees, and for a moment, I'd almost feel her hand on my shoulder. Maybe grief never really leaves, it just learns to walk beside you more gently. One evening, Lily brought me a small wooden box she'd found while cleaning my old workshop. Inside was the pocket knife I'd given her when she was a teenager. "You told me this was for emergencies," she said. I smiled. "I guess we had one." She laughed and pressed it into my palm. "Keep it," she said. "You earned it back." I turned it over in my hand, the metal cool and familiar. It was a simple thing, but it felt like a circle finally closing. The father who'd once given everything away now held something that truly belonged to him, his peace. The world didn't magically become perfect. Bills still came, my knees still ached, and the nights could still feel long. But there was light in them now. Real light. I'd learned that forgiveness doesn't erase pain, it transforms it into something useful. And I'd learned that quiet strength isn't about how loud you shout when you're wronged. It's about how still you stand when the storm passes and you're still there, unbroken. As I sat on my porch one last time that summer, watching the sun dip behind the trees, I thought about everything I'd been through. Betrayal, loss, redemption, it all led to this. Peace not earned by wealth or revenge, but by truth. I smiled as the crickets began to sing. You did good, old man, I whispered to myself. You finally learned. Sometimes the people we think are weakest turn out to be the strongest of all. And Richard Hale had proven that quiet strength can move mountains. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story.